Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for session 3 of the Art Academy outside of Europe. We will now be focusing on South and East Asia. I'd also at this time like to express my gratitude to the Mohican people. We are currently guests on their land. I thank them for their stewardship as well as that of their various neighbors, including the Mohawk, the Pocumtuck, the Nipmuc, and the Abenaki nations. Our first speaker today is Sonal Khullar. Sonal Khullar is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Washington. She's the author of Worldly Affiliations, Artistic Practice, National Identity, and Modernism in India, 1930 to 1990, published in 2015 by the University of California Press. Her current research focuses on conflict, collaboration, and globalization in contemporary art from South Asia. Today she'll be presenting a paper entitled Academy, Ashram, Atelier, the Art School in South Asia. Please join me in welcoming Sonal Khullar.
Thanks, Kailani. I'd like to thank Caro, Yukio, and Claudia for the invitation to present my research here today, and to Sam and Deb for making excellent arrangements for the conference. I've learned a lot from our discussions and your presentations, and I'm looking forward to continuing these conversations today and onward. To all the facts and forms of nature, Indian art willfully and resolutely opposes itself. It will not draw a man, but an 8-armed monster. It will not draw a flower, but only a spiral or a zigzag, claimed John Ruskin in The Two Paths, a treatise on art based on inaugural lectures given at South Kensington, now the Victoria and Albert Museum and Royal College of Art, in January 1858. Written in the wake of the anti-colonial rebellion of 1857, The Two Paths identified dispositions, capacities, and talents of the Indian mutineer and the Scottish Highlander, who belonged to the races of the jungle and the moor, respectively. For Ruskin, these figures represent East and West, barbarism and civilization, crafts and art. Indian artists exhibited a disregard for the laws of nature and a will to pleasure that was befitting of, quote, cruel and savage nations, cruel in temper, savage in habits and conception. Nevertheless, they displayed an excellence in design, what Ruskin called interweaving lines and arranging colors. This critic's ideas were put to work in art schools established across India by the British colonial government during the 19th century. In Madras in 1850, in Calcutta in 1854, in Bombay in 1856, and in Lahore in 1875. These art schools aim to revive crafts, reform craftsmen, improve manufactures, and increase commerce, not to create artists or fine art, as suggested by these images of artisanal wares on display at a colonial exposition in Calcutta on the left, and clay models of craftsmen produced in Lahore on the right. Their curriculum was developed at South Kensington, where art educators such as Henry Hoover Locke, John Lockwood Kipling, John Griffiths, and Ernest Binfield Havel, many of whom had admired the Indian court at the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851, were trained for their mission in the colonies. In 1875, Kipling, Rudyard's father and famed illustrator of the Jungle Book, was appointed principal of the Mayo School of Industrial Art in Lahore and curator of the Lahore Central Museum, after having taught architectural sculpture at the Jamsetji Jijiboi School of Art and Industry, or JJ School, in Bombay since 1865. His career was the subject of a recent retrospective exhibition, John Lockwood Kipling, Arts and Crafts in the Punjab and London, at the Bard Graduate Center Gallery in V&A, which examined the lasting legacy of that movement and figure. Despite the centralizing impulse of imperial policy, each of the art schools in colonial India evolved along distinct lines and played a unique role in the history of modern South Asia. Of the Mayo School in Lahore, C. Pearson, Director of Public Instruction of the Punjab, declared, quote, "Our school is to be an industrial one. We do not wish to imitate the ceramic vases of Madras or the foliated capitals of Bombay, but to draw our experience rather from the royal workshops of the Mughals, from the best specimens of art and industry in modern India." As you can see from these specimens, copies of paintings from the 17th century mosque of Wazir Khan in Lahore, the Mayo School indeed renewed connections to a Mughal and Islamic past, cultivated decorative and manufacturing skills, and contributed to what Saloni Mathur has called the cult of the craftsman. In this paper, I trace peculiar forms of the art school in South Asia as academy, atelier, and ashram between the late colonial and post-colonial periods through the examples of the JJ School in Bombay, the Mayo School in Lahore, and Kala Bhavan, the art school of an anti-colonial nationalist university founded by Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal. Conceived in opposition to their counterparts in Europe, these art schools, all of which remain in operation today, served as a crucible for debates on colonialism and nationalism, tradition and modernity, art and crafts, and yielded distinctive material cultural forms and aesthetic ideologies. Witness the Peacock in Pride overmantel in the Darbar Room, designed by Kipling and Bhairam Singh, a Sikh architect and Kipling's assistant master in Lahore for Queen Victoria at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight between 1890 and 1892. This spectacular bird and room were the product of empire, specifically crafts revival in colonial art schools, and enacted new notions of artistic and cultural identity, of what it meant to be Indian, European, artist, and artisan. In the case of colonial India and Imperial Britain, the Art Academy outside Europe reveals much of the stakes and state of the Art Academy inside Europe, as the transnational careers and cross-cultural citations of critics, artists, educators, and ideologues from Ruskin and Kipling to William Morris and Ananda K. Kumaraswamy attest. The elephant-headed Hindu god, Ganesh, who watches over Queen Victoria's former summer home and rural retreat in England, is evidence of a complex traffic between East and West, propelled by the colonial art school. The art school in post-colonial South Asia is no less a catalyst, node, and pivot for global cultural exchange. The National College of Arts, or NCA in Lahore, formerly the Mayo School, embodies the paradox of a national art school in a global art world and exemplifies the reverberations of colonial art education in a post-colonial society and an Islamic republic. This school has instituted an Ustad-Shagird, master-disciple system in a Western-style academy, training students in modernism and Mughal manuscript culture, and producing contemporary miniatures for Western museums and South Asian society, exemplified by the work of Shazia Sikandar, which you see here, and other distinguished alumni such as Imran Qureshi and Aisha Khalid. These artists have reinvented the miniature form in artist books and rooftop gardens, installations and animation, to which I shall return at the end of the presentation. But for now, back to the 19th century. In the 19th century, art schools across British India followed a syllabus prepared by Richard Redgrave, Inspector General for Art at the Department of Science and Art at South Kensington, the division responsible for higher education and teacher training. Instructors focused on scientific drawing, copying and design at the expense of figure drawing, originality, and expression. Copying illustrations and memory drawing was taught at elementary levels, some drawing from neoclassical sculpture was taught at advanced levels, and drawing from nudes almost not at all. Anatomy lessons and life classes were minimal because they were necessary only to the practice of fine art, of which Indians were deemed incapable. Some art school graduates went on to serve the British Empire in ethnographic surveys and construction projects as draftsmen, modelers, engravers, and lithographers, as these examples of student work from Madras, Lahore, and Bombay in the collection of the V&A suggest. Others took up popular image production and joined the rapidly expanding world of print culture, establishing presses such as the Calcutta Art Studio, whose chromolithograph of Vaishnavite saints in procession you see here. Yet others gained limited entry to the profession of art and enjoyed the patronage of elites and an emerging middle-class public, such as Ganpatrao Ke Matre, whose sculpture of the erstwhile Maharaja of Mysore, Chamarajendra Vadeyar, stands in Chamaraja Circle of that city. Arguably, the most successful academic painter in late 19th century India, Raja Ravi Verma, favored by Indian and British elites, did not receive a formal art education. In this remarkable portrait by Pestonji Bomanji, a graduate of the JJ School in Bombay, a young girl's scribblings are overlaid on the professional drawing of an artist on an easel, acknowledging the place of the Indian artist in the colonial art school, as copyist and child, primitive and feminine person. This painting may well be a gesture of sly civility in Homi Bhabha's sense, whereby the colonial subject offers a critique of power through everyday acts and resists surveillance, containment, and discipline. Note the artist's lively signature on a wooden pallet above his brushes on the bottom right. The heavy drapery and small toy cart suggest a sense or convey a sense of performance and playfulness. Even at schools in Calcutta and Bombay, of which, of course, Bomanji was a graduate, and which enrolled students from relatively elite backgrounds by comparison to Lahore and Madras, the career of professional artist was beyond the reach of most Indians, as they were recruited to assist in public works projects, archaeological expeditions, and museum expansion. All colonial art schools in India were attached to a museum, albeit one that was focused on trade and industry, with exhibits on geography and ethnography, such as the Paudaji Lard Museum, established in 1855 in Bombay as a central museum of natural history, economy, geology, industry, and arts. This museum has recently been restored with its cases and collections very thoughtfully presented for contemporary audiences. With Kipling as teacher and subsequently principal, the JJ School in Bombay was instrumental in the building of the modern city, whose Gothic revival facades are adorned with works by Kipling and his students, such as this bust of David Sassoon, a Baghdadi Jewish businessman and philanthropist. At Crawford Market, located on the same street as the JJ School, they contributed tympanum reliefs representing trade and agriculture, which reflected Kipling's South Kensington training, classical tastes, commitment to craft, and understandings of India as market and village. In this sketch, published in The Graphic in 1872, a revealing image of the operations of the Art Academy in India, Kipling supervises the work of his students on the Crawford Market reliefs while reading a book and standing next to a neoclassical bust and above a relief of acanthus leaves. The subject of those reliefs, trade and agriculture, speak to a third element and key purpose of British art policy in India: industry. Kipling disdained the salaried middle classes, the Naukri Pesha or Munshi classes, and valorized the peasant and craftsman as repositories of Indian tradition, and an antithesis, possibly even antidote, to industrial modernity. In addition to public works, Kipling and his students were active in casting, copying, and collecting from museums in India and Britain, a project that consolidated notions of Indian tradition and its centuries-long decline from a Greco-Roman ideal materialized in Gandharan art. In the 1870s and afterward, students in Bombay worked on a 12-year copying project of the 5th century caves at Ajanta, decorated the Victoria Terminus building, a major railway station in Bombay, and twin of St. Pancras, and earned commissions from the princely rulers of Kutch and Baroda. With John Griffiths and then William Ewart Gladstone Solomon as principal, the school in Bombay placed greater emphasis on art as opposed to science, and encouraged naturalistic representation. This was by the very late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, in part responding to student demand for instruction in fine arts akin to that on offer in art academies in Europe, and bringing the JJ School closer to a Western-style academy. Life drawing and anatomical study were requirements for the photographer Homai Vyaravala and her fellow students, Rehana Mughal and Mani Turner in Bombay in the 1930s. Under Kipling's leadership, the art school in Lahore took a different direction, attracting students from artisanal backgrounds and inventing a tradition of Indian craft. Kipling claimed, quote, "It is the object of the Lahore School to revive crafts now half forgotten and to discourage as much as possible the crude attempts at reproduction of the worst features of Birmingham and Manchester, now so common among natives." Students took classes in woodwork, metalwork, jewelry, pottery, and engraving, studied historical architecture and traditional design, collaborated with workmen and craftsmen, and supplied designs to schools and manufacturers, including a Koftgar in Gujarat, an example of which you see on the left, a Bombay supplier for a silver vase made at Kutch, carpet designs to the industrial schools at Kasur and Hoshiarpur, sketches for ivory and wood inlay to Hoshiarpur, and suggestions for lace work to the Women's Industrial School in Delhi. They were so successful in providing ideas, patterns, and samples for trade and industry that Kipling declared in a report of 1883 and 1884 that Mayo School was more of an atelier and less of a school, a cardinal fault to be remedied. 3 years later, he wrote, "A school of art cannot well be conducted on the factory and jail system. So our earnings as a school must and ought to be limited." Nevertheless, the Mayo School largely functioned in an atelier system along an industrial model and traditionalist principles as its students prepared drawings and models for artisans and architectural details for the Public Works Department, contributed work to numerous exhibitions in India and abroad, and supplied museums with casts of Indian sculpture and architecture, such as this Gandharan Buddha, the original of which Kipling acquired for the Lahore Museum. The plaster cast, as you can see, is at the V&A. Kala Bhavan, the art school at Visva-Bharati University, established by Rabindranath Tagore in Shantiniketan, Bengal in 1918, was an anti-colonial nationalist response, an alternative to the art school as academy and atelier. Imagined by Tagore as an ashram, a retreat, or tapovan, forest school, to recall the all-male Brahminical monasteries of ancient India, Shantiniketan, literally abode of peace, was a rural idyll born of an urban imagination. Inhabited by artists and intellectuals seeking refuge from the city of Calcutta, Kala Bhavan emphasized experiential learning and indigenous image-making practices, repudiating the industrial impulses of the Mayo School and the academic orientations of the art school in Calcutta. The artist, Binod Bihari Mukherjee, one of the institution's first students, described his education there in the 1920s. Quote, "Kwai, red earth, the sal, Shurya robusta forest of Surul, the banks of the Kopai River. These were my steadfast companions." According to Mukherjee, the imperative at Shantiniketan was to be true to nature. In the 1920s and 1930s, Shantiniketan artists interpreted truth to nature broadly. To draw from nature could be to draw on memory, as in Mukherjee's phenomenological explorations of landscape, or to draw on desire, as in Tagore's dreamlike visions of bodies, birds, and beasts, or to draw on the environment, as Ramkinkar Bej did in his monumental portraits and sculptures of Santals, indigenous people from the area. Rejecting academic painting and sculpture taught in colonial art schools, teachers and students at Kala Bhavan looked to nature as a guide, celebrated Adivasi or indigenous culture, renewed crafts traditions, and emulated East Asian models of writing and painting. Hence, this painting of Abanindranath Tagore, Rabindranath's nephew and leader of the Bengal School of Art, by Nandalal Bose, you see that painting on the right. Bose was principal of Kala Bhavan from 1922 until 1951, and he depicts his teacher as an Oriental master, seated at a low desk, citing the legacy of Okakura Kakuzo and other guests of the Tagore family in early 20th century Calcutta, including Nihonga painters Arai Kanpo, Hishida Shunso, and Yokoyama Taikan. That tradition of Pan-Asianism continued at Kala Bhavan through the 1920s and afterward. Mukherjee visited Japan in the 1930s, seeing firsthand the scroll painting traditions that he would translate in a mural, life on campus, on the walls of China Bhavan, the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at Visva-Bharati. While Mukherjee's mural emphasizes cultural aspects of the art school as ashram, presenting it as a secluded and scholarly enterprise, unfolding as episodes between screens and sets along the lines of literati painting, Bose's painting from the same period emphasizes natural dimensions of the art school as ashram, presenting it as a sanctuary in the wilderness with rural and indigenous peoples denoted by the artist's gestural marks and calligraphic strokes. These paintings reveal how particular trajectories of Orientalism and primitivism came together at Kala Bhavan, which upheld notions of Eastern and Western difference, even as it reversed the conventional hierarchy of the colonial art school. To a large extent, Kala Bhavan shared with the art schools in Bombay and Lahore an emphasis on tradition, craft, and decoration as signs of an Indian national cultural or civilizational identity. After Kipling's retirement in 1893, the art school in Lahore was led by Percy Brown, a British administrator, and subsequently Samarendranath Gupta, one of Abanindranath's pupils. Its teachers and students included the artists Abdur Rahman Chughtai and Shakir Ali, whose careers and works provided a counterpoint to the art of the Bengal school and to the art of Kala Bhavan, as you can see in these images that emphasize Islamic civilizational ideals, calligraphy, and abstraction. Although these artists were influential in modern Pakistan, their practices remained individual, even introspective, never becoming a movement. Renamed the National College of Arts in 1958, which Shakir Ali appointed its first Pakistani principal in 1961, this institution established a miniature department in the 1960s, led by hereditary painters and ustads, or masters. Its first ustad, Haji Muhammad Sharif, who had been employed at Mayo since 1944, traced his lineage to courtly workshops in Patiala, now in India. He was succeeded by his disciple, Sheikh Shujaullah of Amer, in the 1970s. Shujaullah's disciple, Bashir Ahmed, currently heads the miniature department and rose to that position by performing traditional duties for the ustad, including, quote, filling his hookah, replenishing his palm leaves, and rinsing his feet. Under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's rule in the 1970s, Pakistan instituted a national cultural policy privileging calligraphy, landscape painting, and miniature painting. Despite the support from the state, the miniature department at NCA remained somewhat marginal, with an emphasis on copying and reproducing historical styles and works of art, until Zahur ul Akhlaq, one of Shakir Ali's students and an abstractionist, whose work you see here, became head of the fine arts department and promoted the study of miniature painting. Given his training with the calligrapher Yusuf Dehlavi in Delhi and interest in Islamic traditions of representation, Zahur was a model for a generation of contemporary miniaturists who came of age in the 1980s and 1990s. Their practice has built on and departed from the techniques they were taught at NCA, deconstructing and expanding the scale and form of miniature painting. Saira Wasim's works, executed in the wake of 9/11 and the US-led war on terror, satirized geopolitical and social arrangements by rerouting forms of Mughal painting from the court of Jahangir. These works play on the special relationship between Bush and Bush, President George W. Bush and General Pervez Musharraf, displaying Black humor, a sense of parody, and a penchant for pastiche, as Salima Hashmi has put it. In 2013, Imran Qureshi produced an installation at the Met, painting its rooftop garden red and titling the work, "And How Many Rains Must Fall Before the Stains Are Washed Clean," after a poem by Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Splattering an 8,000 square foot terrace with acrylic paint and making it over into a crime scene or a site of ritual slaughter, in the words of one critic, Qureshi wished to initiate a dialogue with life through this landscape of death, and offer a critique of violence in South Asia and the world. Such works speak as much to Wasim and Qureshi's training at NCA as to a demand from Western audiences for Pakistani art that corresponds either to what Qudus Mirza has called the beautiful art of miniature making or spectacularized images of violence and terror. Qureshi's installation fulfills both requirements. Mirza's view resonates with Holland Cotter's assessment of Hanging Fire, an exhibition of contemporary art from Pakistan at the Asia Society curated by Salima Hashmi, a former principal of the NCA, which presented, quote, several exercises in issue-driven whimsy and projected Pakistan as one big danger zone. For Cotter, this show, with its references to war, religion, and consumerism, was emblematic of the Asia Society's approach to curating culture, quote, topical in content, market-ready in format, and didactic in delivery. Wasim and Qureshi were trained at the NCA in the miniature department of a Western-style academy with a largely middle-class student body comprising young women and men, unlike all male Mughal workshops, in which art making was collaborative and knowledge often passed from father to son or other familial networks. Students at the NCA are taught to make their own paper and brushes in the traditional manner, the latter by catching and gluing the hair of living cats and dead squirrels, as in this famous Mughal painting of an artist, climbing a plane tree to secure materials for his work. Yet students at the NCA use Winsor & Newton paints, complete individual thesis projects, and specialize in miniature painting only in their last 2 years of study after taking a full range of courses in drawing, technical drawing, sculpture, design, and Western art history, with some study of the Indus Valley culture. The miniature department is a patriarchal and hierarchical system in which the ustad sits here and is a master to be served and pleased, who enforces discipline and discourages experimentation among his shagird. Virginia Wiles describes the system. Below the master's mezzanine, students and teachers sit cross-legged on cushions and carpets on the floor, with a wide board placed behind at an angle of 60 degrees to support the back against the wall. A drawing board supports handmade vasli, paper support, in the lap. Brushes and water paints are mixed in seashells with handmade brushes all laid neatly to one side. My visit to the NCA in 2018 confirmed Wiles's insights and observations. Quote, compared with fine art studios, where the competing rhythms of Bhangra rap and Qawwali songs resonate from huge ghetto blasters, here all is muted concentration. The atmosphere evokes that of a 19th century workshop, reenacted by 21st century teenagers for a folk festival. End quote. Elsewhere, the NCA feels akin to a Western-style academy, with practices that are familiar from my department at the University of Washington, where students fiercely guard the contents of their lockers, inscribing them with graffiti, work with easels, create architectural models, and play with their phones in class and outside of it. Yet the miniature department at this academy is perhaps its best known and most successful program in the international art world. For more than a decade, contemporary miniatures have been a key export for Pakistan, marking continuity with a great tradition and an ancient discipline, to quote the Met's website on Qureshi's installation. Such exhibition practices echo the logic of the art school as atelier and reinscribe the South Asian artist as artisan within a global economy. They suggest the need to unsettle historical legacies whereby a modern art school in an Islamic republic resembles, quote, a 19th century workshop reenacted by 21st century teenagers for a folk festival. How does the Postcolonial Art Academy reproduce notions of Eastern and Western difference, with Eastern artists functioning as repositories of tradition and Western artists as harbingers of modernity, and continue the work of colonial art school as atelier, workshop, and factory? Thank you.
Our next speaker is Juliane Noth. Juliane Noth is a Heisenberg Fellow at the Art Historical Seminar of Hamburg University. The focus of her research is on Chinese art and visual culture of the 20th century, and she is the author of Landschaft und Revolution, die Malerei von Xi Lu, published in 2009. She has recently completed the manuscript of her second book, In Search of the Chinese Landscape, Ink Painting, Travel, and Transmedial Practice in Modern China. Her paper today is entitled Writing About Chinese Art and Teaching Ink Painting at the National Academy of Arts in Hangzhou, 1928 to 1937. Please welcome Juliane Noth.
Yeah, so thank you so much. All of you, for being here, and thank you for having me, Yukio and Claudia, and thank you, Sam and Caro, for organizing this wonderful conference. So. The National Academy of Arts in Hangzhou, which is now the China Academy of Art, was founded in 1928 with the aim to establish a modern, state-of-the-art art education in China that could compete with international standards, and which at the same time functioned also as an Academy of Arts that provided its members with the freedom to create art for the nation. Most of the faculty, including the young founding director Lin Fengmian, who was 28 at the time of the founding of the Academy, had only recently returned from their studies in France, and their experiences there shaped how they conceived the work of the Academy. the function of art and notions of artistic quality, and how they thought about the future of Chinese art. The role of Chinese painting in ink within this institutional structure and ideological outlook was a complicated one. Since the Academy's raison d'etre was to reform artistic practices in China, which were kind of thought of as being messy and very leading to the decline of the Chinese nation state and the failure of the Chinese empire. They had their aim was to reform those practices and to ensure cultural survival. And so the status quo to which they responded had necessarily to be described as very bleak. Accordingly, the programmatic statements in their publications were invariably accompanied by devastating assessments of the state of the Chinese art world. And this critique also extended to the history of Chinese painting during recent centuries, which was regarded as ultimately leading to the contemporary predicament. So therefore, although the Academy's motto was, so this is their letterhead, introduce Western art, systematize Chinese art, harmonize Eastern and Western art, and create art of the era, the future of traditional Chinese art practices in the art of the era seemed not very promising. On the other hand, ink painting was regarded as representative of Chinese national culture and identity, and thus it could not be completely neglected in an academy that claimed national relevance. Ink painting was therefore part of the academy's curriculum, and the school was established with an independent ink painting department, but within the first year of its existence, the Chinese painting or ink painting was merged with Western painting, which is oil painting, into a painting department. And I think the reason for this may have been the large discrepancy in student enrollment. Judging from the graduation works of the first two classes, only 1 student out of 9 in the first class and 3 students out of 21 from the second class specialized in ink painting, and all others in oil. And the ratio remained roughly the same for the fourth class, with only 2 students specializing in ink and 14 in oil painting. And oil painting was clearly the most popular subject with students. Taking the numbers from classes 1, 2, and 4 together, the painting department had 46 students, out of which 40 specialized in oil. And the design department, which initially also included the architecture department, had roughly half the number of students, and the sculpture department only 7. This prevalence of Western painting is also reflected in the number of teachers, with professors specializing in oil painting making up almost half of the faculty. Courses in the painting department, as recorded in the yearbook of 1930, included charcoal drawing, ink painting, and oil painting, with additional theory classes in Chinese art history, Western art history, aesthetics, anatomy, perspective, Chinese, French, music, and military training. And Western art history was highlighted as mandatory for all students in the academy, whereas Chinese art history wasn't. And the yearbook of 1934 also detailed the weekly lessons spent on every subject. And the undergraduate students in the painting department had 24 lessons in oil painting, but only 9 lessons in ink. It is therefore safe to say, I think, that ink painting was in a marginalized position within the Hangzhou Academy. And this can also be concluded from its visual representations in the yearbooks. In 1930, 2 photographs each were printed of the studios for the modern subjects, such as, how does the pointer work? Oh yeah, sorry. So this is, sorry. So this is Western painting classes or oil painting classes, and they have two photographs of this and also of the design department and the sculpture department, and only 1 photograph of the art history class and the Chinese painting class, which is painted on tables. The prevalence of Western painting technique and European art history in the curriculum is also reflected in the number of articles dedicated to European art in the Academy's publications and in the writings on Chinese art. Most of the texts on Chinese art were written by the same authors who also wrote about European art, and who neither specialized in Chinese art or Chinese art history nor in Chinese painting. So this was primarily Lin Fengmian, the director and professor of Western painting, and Lin Wenzheng, who was an art historian by training, so they had studied in France together, and he was also the provost. Moreover, the literature on which the authors based their arguments was for the major part written by European authors. And this was not only the case with those texts written by, what one might call westernizers, such as the two Lins, but also those written by the ink painting professor Pan Tianshou. Discursive authority was firmly placed or attributed to Western scholarship on Chinese art and could only be questioned by citing other Western authors. In the following, I will outline how writings by European authors were used in the negotiations of Chinese art and how this eventually shaped how its history and current practices were envisioned at the Academy. And most of the articles in question were published in the Academy's main journal, which was called Apollo. No image of, this is for David. Not bringing the cover image. So, the first texts on Chinese art published in Apollo were two texts by European authors. One is the German philosopher Hermann Keyserling, and the other is the French art historian Élie Faure, and each was followed by a long response by Lin Wenzheng. The text by Keyserling is a brief chapter titled The Importance of Chinese Art from the second edition of his Philosophy as Art from 1922. And the longer text by Faure is his chapter on Chinese art in his multi-volume Histoire d'Art, first published in 1911. Keyserling's text focuses exclusively on religious art, which he, without giving any specific examples, terms the most supreme art of the entire world. Because here in Chinese religious art, Indian profundity, introduced to China with Buddhism, found a perfect embodiment. According to Keyserling, the, I quote, ideal of the congruence of meaning and expression in the sense that utter depth bestowed its spirit in the most sublime form, was only realized in China. Faure too writes about Buddhist art, apparently with the monumental sculptures from the cave temples in Yungang and Longmen in mind, which he reproduced from photographs taken by Edouard Chavannes in 1907. So this one was reproduced both by Chavannes and by Faure. He writes that here Buddhist sculpture finds its supreme expression, but different from Keyserling, he's concerned with formal means. He sees in these sculptures a science of light, not to be found even among the greatest sculptors, and which is common to, I quote, all the strange international Buddhist sculpture in which the Greek influence is still manifest, unquote. And then he adds that China can only very reluctantly have submitted to this creed, which was imposed to them by the invaders from the Central Asian plains. And here he refers to the Turkic rulers of the Northern Wei dynasty who initially laid out these caves. So he treats Buddhist art as ultimately exterior to Chinese art or to Chinese culture. In their Orientalism and their very generalizing and sometimes racist statements about Indian and Chinese culture, the two texts are very typical of much of the literature and Asian art from the early 20th century. And this mode of thinking was also shared by Chinese authors who were preeminently occupied with their own national culture and identity. Although neither Keyserling nor Fo were specialists on Chinese art, and both give a positive assessment of Buddhist sculpture, the responses by Lin Wenzheng to the two chapters could not be more different. His commentary on the former is titled, "Do Not Be Fooled by Keyserling," whereas he takes Fo's chapter as a critical standard for the evaluation of Chinese art. And it appears to me that the reason for this is simply that Keyserling's evaluation was too uncritically positive, whereas Fo delivers a mixture of Orientalist stereotypes on the immobility and stagnation of Chinese culture on the one hand, and enthusiastic and highly subjective descriptions of the formal properties of Chinese art on the other. Lin Wenzheng writes that to believe Keyserling, or to believe Keyserling's claims about the superiority of Chinese art would be highly detrimental to its future development because it insinuates that reforms would not be necessary. And one important argument that Lin Wenzheng proposes to counter Keyserling is that in early Buddhist sculptures, such as those in Lungmen and Yungang, not only the religion proper was introduced from India, but also Greco-Indian art. So here we have Gandhara again. Therefore, Chinese sculpture cannot be regarded as an original invention by the Chinese in the first place, but should be considered from its Greco-Indian, or in other words, Western origins. In his After Reading Ili Fo, Lin Wenzheng points out that Fo attributes the highest value to sculpture, and painting came only second in Fo's opinion. And this is a reversal, actually, of traditional Chinese art historiography, which did not treat sculpture on the same level or in the same categories as calligraphy and painting. And typically, calligraphy is not treated by either Keyserling or Fo in their writings. So Lin Wenzheng complains that the Chinese only realized what treasures they actually had in Lungmen and Yungang after Westernizers had begun to explore these sites. His main concern, however, is with contemporary art and its state of crisis. And he postulates that only Western scholarship could save Chinese culture, and that present-day artists must welcome Western art, just like ancient Buddhist sculpture had incorporated Indian art. And only then could there be any hope for the renaissance of East Asian cultures. The Indian origins of early Buddhist sculpture, which could be extended to Greece via Gandharan art, are a recurrent theme in the writings on Chinese art and Apollo. It is also taken up by Lin Fengmian, the director, in his article, A Re-Evaluation of Chinese Painting. Lin gives a much broader reassessment of the history of Chinese painting that is based on a really wide range of sources. But he makes it clear at the outset that in his view, the development of a national culture depended on taking its indigenous culture as the basis for adopting the culture of other nations in order to create a new and flourishing era. Lin Fengmian too builds his argument around Buddhist art and the connection from Greece via Gandhara into China, but he stretches the link even further. First, he compares different periodizations in recent historiography by Western, Chinese, and Japanese authors, and then he proposes an entirely new periodization. So the first period would be before the introduction of Buddhism in the 2nd century of the Christian era, and before this time, before the introduction of Buddhism painting had mainly decorative functions, according to Lin. Then the second period is from the introduction of Buddhism until the end of the Song dynasty in 1279. And the third period is from the Yuan dynasty, that is from the late 13th century to the present. And this is an era of transition and beginning of the third period. So if I understand correctly, the third period hadn't really begun yet. Lin Fengmian thus implies that the last 600 years of Chinese painting history were a sort of vacuum during which almost nothing new was created and which would inevitably lead to a renewed introduction of foreign elements. And this vacuum was still ongoing at the time of his writing. The reason for this perceived vacuum is the view, which was very widely held by many writers during the early 20th century, that later painters were only preoccupied with copying earlier masters and therefore had lost all their own creativity. And the reason why Lin identifies the millennium between the 2nd and the 13th century as the heyday of Chinese painting is again the supposed influence of Western art via Buddhism. And the theoretical means by which Lin Fengmian links Indian, or more correctly, Gandharan Buddhist art to the Chinese painting of the 5th to 9th centuries is a term that he translates as 曲线美, or curved line beauty. And he borrows this term from the French philosopher and art critic Eugène Véran, who in his book L'Esthétique from 1878 interprets William Hogarth's serpentine line as a combination of rigidity and softness in superior harmony and as the line of life. Lin Fengmian identifies curved line beauty in Greek sculpture and Chinese painting that cannot really be, in Greek sculpture, such as the Scopulas of Myron, as you see here, and in the canonical Chinese paintings by Gu Kaizhi and Wu Daozi. So this is Gu Kaizhi, and no painting by Wu Daozi survives. So this is a copy, a much later copy, which was reproduced by among others, by John C. Ferguson in his Chinese painting, which these authors also cited. So this is one of the paintings they might refer to when they speak about or write about Wu Daozi. So he supposes there's this kind of curved line beauty in all these three examples, and he thereby establishes a tenuous link between Greek sculpture and Chinese painting, or early Chinese painting, that cannot really be explained with Buddhist art, I think, but only with the goals of the Hangzhou Academy to synthesize Chinese and Western art. Pan Tianshou, the leading professor of ink painting at the Academy, also published several articles on the history of Chinese painting and Apollo, of which the last, which was titled A Brief Study on the Influx of Foreign Paintings into China, is of special interest here. Pan Tianshou too writes about the prevalence of Buddhist painting in early Chinese art, but he identifies the Central Asian painting style introduced by painters such as Yu Yiseng as rendering plasticity by means of tonal contrast. So this is an example of Central Asian painting style in Western China cave temples in Dunhuang. Pan Tianshou then adds that this did not find many followers because the outline style of Gu Kaizhi and Wu Daozi conformed much more to Chinese tastes. So actually, he cites the same artists as Lin Fengmian, Gu Kaizhi and Wu Daozi, but he does it for the opposite arguments. And his argument is that their linear painting style, and not the relievo style of Central Asian origins, was representative of the character of the Chinese nation. And furthermore, he adds a chapter on the historical moment of adaptation of European painting techniques that is conspicuously absent in the accounts by the two Lins. And this is the work by Jesuit painters at the Qing court during the 18th century. And Giuseppe Castiglione was the most successful and best known of these painters. The Jesuit painters created a style that synthesized European techniques such as anatomical drawing and perspective with Chinese painting techniques. Pan Tianshou quotes a letter by the French painter, also a Jesuit painter, Jean-Denis Attiret, who complains that it was necessary, I quote, necessary for me to forget, so to speak, all that I had already learned and to make for myself a new style in order to conform to the taste of the nation. And this is the English translation by Stephen Bushell, which Pan Tianshou is quoting in the Chinese translation. And then Pan Tianshou adds a number of quotations by 18th century Chinese literati who wrote about this kind of painting style, or what they knew about Western painting, and which was that it lacked brushwork and it was not elegant, and in short, that it did not conform to the aesthetics of literati painting, and that it was the work of artisans. So in fact, one could describe Pan's text as a history of the failed attempts to introduce foreign painting to China. Pan Tianshou also cites Western authors, but he cites the works of specialized overviews on Chinese art or painting that represent the state of the field in the early 20th century, like Stephen Bushell, John C. Ferguson, and Lawrence Binion. And they all these authors express their sympathy for Chinese aesthetics, and they try to convey these Chinese views of Chinese art to the Western audiences to some degree. Pan Tianshou then concludes by citing Lawrence Binion's opinion that Eastern and Western art should each retain their characteristics, and Pan Tianshou himself adds that a synthesis of both would be detrimental to either of them. And this kind of synthesis that he had in mind was probably the kind exemplified by the Jesuit painters at the Qing court, or by the Nihonga painters in Japan, and by Chinese paintings of the Lingnan school, like Gao Qifeng, whom you see here, who had studied in Japan and adopted the Nihonga style into something called New Chinese painting. And Pan's opposition to this kind of synthesis shaped how Chinese painting was taught at the Hangzhou Academy. Judging from the graduation works of the first, second, and fourth classes, teachers and students of ink painting did not really heed the urgent calls by Lin Fengmian and Lin Wenzheng for reform or for the adoption of European painting styles. For example, the graduation work by Jiang Daixia, who was the only student in the first painting class who specialized in ink painting, it is a loose interpretation of just the kind of orthodox landscape painting against which the two Lins were actually writing. So this is the kind of painting that supposedly led to the decline of Chinese culture. And it's a style that is very canonical in Chinese literati painting, and which goes back to this very famous 14th century painter, Huang Gongwang. And the graduation piece of Zhang Jinghao, and unfortunately I only have those black and white copies, and also of most of the other painting students, are clearly indebted to the characteristic so-called epigraphic painting style of Pan Tianshou himself, which uses bold black ink lines imitating ancient scripts and compositions that stress the two-dimensionality of the picture plane, solids and voids, in a manner that is likewise inspired by ancient and modern interpretations of ancient scripts in calligraphy. But even Lin Fengmian himself, who experimented with a broad range of painting modes in oil and ink at the time, did not use realist techniques in ink. Instead, his paintings of melancholic birds from the late 1920s and early 1930s seem to draw on so different sources as Chan or Zen painting, Wassily Kandinsky from the Blaue Reiter period, and epigraphic painting. And in fact, they are sometimes quite similar to Pantianshou's painting from the same period. Thank you very much.
All right, it looks like we're all back from coffee break. So we are continuing session 3 on the Art Academy in Asia, in South Asia and East Asia. And our next presenter is Ren Wei. Ren Wei is an assistant professor of art history at Dickinson College. Her research interests focus primarily on 19th and 20th century Chinese art, modern design in East Asia, and Sino-Japanese artistic exchange in the modern period. She is currently completing her book manuscript on modern Chinese design, and today she's sharing her current work, The Rhetoric of Sketching from Life in Western-Style Painting in Republican China, 1911 to 1949. Please welcome Ren Wei.
Hello, hello. I want to first thank Claudia and Yukio for inviting me, and I have to admit that this is a very special experience for me because I went to Williams College, as a lot of you know, and it was a trip to the Clark Art Institute with Michael Casson in my freshman year that convinced me that I could change my major from math and econ to art history. So with extra gratitude, I thank Caroline, Samantha, Deb, and all the staff at the Clark for organizing this gathering. I would like to contribute today by discussing with you some observations on the most discussed rhetoric of the period, namely sketch from life, and how it was conceptualized and practiced in newly established art schools in the 1920s and 30s in Shanghai. It was entrepreneurial to establish private art schools then, and before the founding of the first National Art Academy in 1928, discussed by Juliane, the private institutions served as a hotbed for experimentation with what was understood as academic training. What you see is a book cover of Michael Sullivan's Art and Artists of 20th Century China, published in 1996. I'm always puzzled by the book cover design because it's not an image that most art historians, Chinese art historians, would recognize. It's a painting by a Taiwanese artist in 1988. The book was subsequently translated into Chinese, and the cover image of the Chinese edition is a cropping of a 1980 photograph showing students sketching outdoors. For the Chinese audience, this is the true watershed moment in Chinese art, when artists began to sketch from direct observation. The overwhelming emphasis on sketching from life is a reaction to the perceived backwardness of Chinese painting. The blame of this backwardness fell on the moribund practices of copying old masters, following painting manuals, and the recent fashion of copying photographs. Sketching from life was regarded as more scientific, authentic, and moralistic, thereby providing the much-needed antidote to the copying method. The photograph, as cover image, attests to the historical significance of this initiative. Several scholars have written about the controversies surrounding sketching the female nude. So today I will focus on outdoor landscape painting in the Chinese context in the 1920s and 30s. The photograph was taken in 1918 on the occasion of the nation's first Sketch from Life excursion undertaken by students and teachers of the Shanghai Fine Art School, China's first private art school established in 1912. Outings and excursions to famous places quickly became part of the sketch from nature training for Western and Chinese-style painters alike. The Shanghai Fine Art School took students to nearby sites twice a week, and twice a year, the school also arranged elaborate 2 to 3 week excursions to famous sites outside Shanghai. Encounters with art forms of other cultures in the previous centuries had never quite shaken the Chinese confidence in their own art until the modern period. Encroachment in China by Western imperialist powers and the simultaneous opening of channels of information from the West make this period the most introspective and receptive moment in Chinese history. The pressure of modernization forced intellectuals and artists to reassess China's artistic heritage vis-à-vis Western art and technology. The idea that nature cultivates the sense of beauty and that sketching from life in nature is an edifying experience is not unique to China. But it is rare that a top-down aesthetic education was implemented with such conviction in a semi-colonized China. Both complementing and reacting against the educational reforms' disproportionate emphasis on ethics, intelligence, and physical fitness, aesthetic education gained momentum in the late 1910s, thanks to Tsai Yuanpei, who became modern China's first Minister of Education. Central to Tsai's romanticist belief is that aesthetic education should replace religion as the principal vehicle to maintain morality in Chinese society, and that aesthetic education can nurture the universally existing perception of beauty. Influenced by both his studies of Kantian philosophy in Leipzig University and Chinese thinkers before him, he claims that a sense of beauty alone is enough to remove one's distinction between self and other and eradicate selfishness, thereby fostering good moral values independent of religion or Chinese ethics. Sketch from life was thought to cultivate good morals, and that true artists were imagined to be moralistically advanced. This idea that good artists must be moralistically superior originated in China in the 10th century, but the 20th century artist subscribes to the idea to an altogether different reason. And this idea still affects China today. In fact, in June, I was in Beijing for a conference, and all the professors talking about how somebody was so moralistically superior by taking their student to sketch from life using money out of their own pocket. In the winter of 1919, the painter Liu Haisu, whose earlier work you see here, who also one of the founders of the first private art school, the Shanghai Fine Art School, recorded an anecdote that reveals the link between sketching from life, morality, and aesthetic education. So one day Liu was out sketching, and he was first mistaken by passers-by for a surveyor dispatched by the government, and then as a professional painter looking for ideas to supplement commercial beauty prints, and lastly, a Japanese artist, because no Chinese artist would bother to sketch from nature. Amused, but more frustrated by these comments, Liu laments how the lack of sense of beauty led to more poor morality and greed, and that China desperately needed to develop aesthetic education. Sketch from life excursions were quite newsworthy in the 1910s and 1920s, not because of its novelty, not only because of its novelty, but it was also the most visible implementation of aesthetic education to the public eye. What you see is a photograph documenting the female students from a local all-girls school sketching the drum tower in Nanjing. And fine arts education was essential to all-girls schools during the period, as the females were regarded as the agent for aesthetic education within the family unit. Not only Western-style painters, Chinese-style painters also were required to sketch from nature on excursions. What you see is the Chinese painting students from Shanghai Fine Art School taking a group photograph after sketching from life at the Buddhist caves in Lingyin Temple in Hangzhou. It is ironic that a painting tradition known for the rhetoric of following past masters is not as good as learning from nature itself rarely painted from observation prior to the modern period. The tools in Chinese painting are not portable, and the process requires a studio setting. So it cannot accommodate the constant shift between making and matching. Chinese ink painters during the modern period began to use pencils and watercolors and all the other tools to sketch from life, like their oil painting counterparts. This is a very large spread of a picture students and school officials at Westlake after a sketch from life trip. In reality, the newsworthy act of going out to sketch nature was ironically much more important than the final works resulting from that experience. The opportunity to observe and enjoy historically famous sites itself provided the edifying exercise required and romanticized by aesthetic education. Despite the repeated emphasis on direct observation, the actual goal of sketching from life, as I will demonstrate in the next few minutes, was neither verisimilitude nor realism. Now, before the founding of specialized art schools, drawing and painting were taught in normal schools. I have to say that normal schools are very essential to the educational reforms in East Asia, following the sort of, École Normale Supérieure system, and what was then referred to as sketch from life was in fact a kind of conceptual art. That's what they call it. A graduate recalls that in the Western style painting examination, normal school graduates have to take in 1911, the test taker had to paint a battleship using watercolor. And since no student in the class had never seen a battleship, they had only their imagination to rely on to complete the sketch from life. What you see is the building of the first higher normal school in Nanjing, founded in 1902. And so you have to realize that after the abolishing of the millennium-long imperial examination, which serves to select civil government officials, it was abolished in 1905. So after that, they actually would collect all the top students from all the local normal schools for a final examination in Beijing to select not actually teachers, but government officials. So the best school students were selected to become officials so that they have to paint battleships and planes. But at the same time, the teacher who actually taught painting at the Liangjiang Higher Normal School is Yukio, who self-portrait you see here, a graduate of Tokyo School of Fine Arts. So, this sort of artistic persona. So the students were learning, doing things like that, but then at the exam, they had to paint battleships. The actual going out to nature to sketch really took off in earnest when painters returning from their training in Japan began to assume teaching positions in newly established art schools and normal schools. Influenced by French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, the plenarism style promoted by Japanese painters such as Kuroda Seki and Fujishima Takeji were particularly attractive to the Chinese artists studying in Japan, and several artists worked under Fujishima Takeji when they studied in Tokyo. Needless to say that direct observation and the artist's ability to render luminous effects of natural light elevated painting to the level of natural sciences. The perceived optical truth embodied by the plenarist style justified the usefulness of Western-style painting to the nation's process of modernization, especially under the fear of being colonized. For example, these are two examples of the sort of luminous effect that the earlier oil paintings were trying to achieve in China. For example, the first oil painting textbook, published in 1928, took pains to elaborate on the importance of rendering different light effect, citing scientific theories of color and light, allegedly published by the French Academy of Sciences. The author here also added a cover image of a painter sketching a landscape outdoors. So this is sort of the ideal existence persona of a modern Chinese artist. And this author, Chen Baoyi, studied under Fujishima Takeji in Tokyo. So the goal of direct observation was not to achieve verisimilitude, but to render the sensation of light, conveying both optical truth and the artist's subjectivity expressed by his or her mastery of color. The Sino-Japanese terms surrounding sketching from life are another factor crucial to understanding why verisimilitude was not of concern, despite the repeated emphasis on direct observation. So in the interest of time, I will make two brief observations. First, sketch from life is 写生 or 写生 in Chinese and Japanese, direct meaning to sketch or depict life. And it comes from a family of Sino-Japanese terms start with 写, to depict. So you have depict truth is photography, to depict reality is realism, to depict conceptualism is a kind of a genre of abstract painting dated to as early as the 9th century in China. So 写生 is folded, along with these terms. So it's very versatile. And sometimes, 写生 can be connected to photography or realism or sketch conceptualism. So it's a very accepting term. Second, traditionally, xiesheng indeed referred to paintings striving for verisimilitude in the Sino-Japanese tradition. Xiesheng itself is a classical Chinese term appearing frequently by the 10th century, and you see this very famous painting dated to the 10th century with literally the title xiesheng zhenxin tu, right? The xiesheng of the sketch of life, the sketch from life of rare birds. And it is also, the term xiesheng is also the translation for the general practice of plein-air drawings in the European tradition. In early 20th century China, however, artists were determined to disentangle the goal of sketch from life from both a Chinese verisimilitude and the kind of realism associated with Gustave Courbet. Aesthetic education theories' claim on the non-distinction between subject and object enabled sketch from life to become a vehicle for self-expression. Depicting external objects is only a reflection of subjectivity. So, how do paintings substantiate or not the period's overwhelming theorization of sketch from life? What you see here is oil painting reproduced in an issue of the 1934 pictorial, The Young Companion, a very popular pictorial, but the work was probably created around 1930 by the painter Niell. I apologize for some of the watermarks you are going to see in this presentation, which is inherent to the nature of research in early 20th century Chinese art, because very few original works from this period survived, and subsequent, and the art history of this period used to be written with works that only survived. So I think that using electronic databases present both challenges and opportunities to really reevaluating this period. This painting depicts the famous historic site, Tiger Hill in Suzhou, which is a popular day trip destination from Shanghai. All right, Tiger Hill. Tiger Hill is famous for two main sites: the secret tomb of an ancient king marked by the sword pool, and the Song Dynasty 7-story octagonal leaning pagoda. Over the centuries, Tiger Hill has accrued so much literary, historical, and mythical associations that it became one of the most visited and depicted sites in China. I'm showing you two period photographs of the two sites. Numerous painters have visited and depicted Tiger Hill in Chinese history. This 15th century painting by Shen Zhou sort of fulfills one's expectation of a depiction of this famous place, a architecturally superior monastic complex against a background of misty landscape dotted by a lone fisherman. The painting's sky-high panorama allows for an imaginative, compressed view impossible to acquire from direct observation. Ni's painting's decisive exclusion of all sites famous in Tiger Hill represents a general tendency for modern painters when sketching outdoors. The painting puts the viewer at a realistic point of observation. The viewer looks down on a descending path to the village houses filling up the middle ground. And through an open expanse of field, the silhouette of a distant mountain extends the horizon under an evening glow. The extensive depth of the view is accentuated by the narrow cropping of a tree on the left and a nondescript kind of house placed at an angle to the right. Sketch from life excursions must occur at famous places, but the painters shun away from famous views. The artist is out there at a site deeply rooted in poetry and legends, an edifying experience fulfilling aesthetic education. But he looks to the opposite direction, detaching his work from the famous views that were frequently reproduced in photographs. In 1929, Guan Zilan, a female painter, sketched in West Lake in Hangzhou, and she adopted a similar high vantage perspective, likewise framing the view with closer objects sort of closing in on both sides. Arguably, China's most scenic spot, Hangzhou's West Lake, is hardly recognizable in this painting. True observation from life defamiliarizes historically celebrated places, which were often evocative, poetic imageries achieved through affective resonance rather than physical sight, such as in the case of 10 views of the West Lake, 12 views of the Tiger Hill, and the most famous poetic trope in East Asia, the 8 views of Xiaoxiang. In earlier paintings, the West Lake has been rendered with a bird's eye panorama seen in this 13th century painting. But one has to realize that Republican period artists would not have the opportunity to encounter paintings of the past. So they were not reacting against images like this. They would probably really like this if they had seen this. They were reacting against Chinese paintings' perennial disregard for the sense of vision in favor of everything extra pictorial. The fact that the meanings of Chinese painting are always found outside the picture. The artist believed that the inherited appreciation of the extra pictorial deteriorated into pointless copying of masterworks. By focusing on color and composition, these matter-of-fact landscape paintings achieved an alternative mode of abstraction other than painting's traditional role of poetic abstraction by way of the extra pictorial. Turning away from famous views at famous places offered a great lesson in compositional skills and more effective in nurturing good aesthetics because the artist could no longer rely on established views. The painter Ding Yeyong, also a graduate of Tokyo School of Fine Arts, teaching at the Shanghai Fine Arts School, complained that on a sketch from life excursion he organized to West Lake, every student began by painting memorial archways, giant Buddhas, the lake center pavilion, and the 3 pools mirroring the Moon Island, which is actually one of the 10 famous views of West Lake, and that they completely misunderstood the goal of outdoor landscape painting, mistaking sketch from life for drawing famous views as souvenirs. Returning to the photograph I showed earlier, the actual famous view at the site is actually the Longhu Pagoda, but you see here all of the students, decisively turning away from the monastic temple and the beautiful scenery around the temple and looking at something, the cottage across from it, and this would be the result of this elaborate sketch from life, spring flowers against a cottage. And if we align Ni Duo's painting with Shenzhou's painting from 15th century, I think Ni would have really appreciated Shenzhou's 15th century rendering of Tiger Hill had he been able to see it. But what Ni did see and was influenced by are works by French painters he listed, such as Manet, Maurice de Flamenc, Matisse, Paul Cézanne, but also female artists, Marie Laurencin and Jacqueline Marval. It is interesting that they embraced all of the academic practice of figure drawing, the nude, sketching from life, but the painters they admired really kind of embody the antithesis of academic art. The striking similarity in composition between Cézanne's painting, La Maison du Pendu from 1873, and Ni's Tiger Hill suggests that Ni was familiar with Cézanne's work through reproduction, a fact that he acknowledged throughout his career. It is ironic that a view of Auvers-sur-Oise, north of Paris, was found in a sketch from life in Suzhou's Tiger Hill. The differences between the two paintings, however, are more telltale of the circumstances of Western-style painting in China. Ni's painting does not have the heavy buildup of paint seen in Cézanne's. Despite that I'm working from reproduction, I realize it, but it's actually true compared with Ni's work that did survive, that he preferred this sort of translucent color than the heavy buildup of oil. Another reason is that what you see here is a postcard of a work by Matisse reproduced for the exhibition of contemporary French paintings held in Tokyo in 1928. And Ni was in Tokyo then and saw the exhibition, and many artists bought this postcard. So, you see the color intensity and the brushwork are very similar to that of Ni's painting. And Ni's harsh and heavy black outlines also betrayed Cézanne's belief that all forms can be reduced to cones, circles, and cubes. I don't have time to give a due discussion on the rhetoric of outline here, but I'm glad that Juliane did a little bit for me. But I should say that lines are deeply seated in East Asian pictorial tradition. Lines were regarded as imbued with vital force, reflecting the idea of both containment and a world in flux. So paintings, but paintings without outlines, known as the boneless style, were likewise appreciated throughout Chinese history. So an aversion to lines was never quite developed in China, even when artists were embracing the non-linear methods in oil painting. On the contrary, the use of harsh, undercrafted lines was often thought as more expressive by increasing the tactile quality of the painting. Here you see a painting by Liu Haizu, who's actually acquired by the French government, and we see him already moving away from a frontal view of the famous sites, right? And you can see that he uses these sort of daubs of colors without outlines, but he also felt no constraints in outlining in these really harsh, dark lines for the trees and the architecture in the painting. The preference for outline is not limited to landscape painting. The period's most prominent oil painter, remember that guy who became the head of the First Chinese Academy in 1928 at age 28, these two paintings are by him, and he likewise mobilized this really heavy and jagged outlines to achieve a more gestural impression of mark making and pictorial expressiveness. Cézanne aside, most French painters admired by Chinese artists had already been under the influence of Japanism, and the French artists were particularly attracted to the expressive linear quality seen in Japanese prints and painting. And that leads to my final twist to Niell's painting, which is that what was most attractive to ndez-Dura in Cézanne's painting is its composition, which in fact is a result of a pictorial experiment Cézanne carried out after his encounter with Japanese art, especially prints of famous places by Utagawa Hiroshige. Cézanne and Hiroshige used similar compositional device of oblique lines in the landscape as seen in one of Hiroshige's prints from the series entitled 69 Stations of the Kisokaido, which is often considered as, in fact, both the sublimation of East Asian pictorial habits and a complete internalization of Western-style perspective. Modern Chinese artists would not have been struck by Hiroshige directly due to the perceived low status of the print medium in East Asia and the two cultures' shared artistic past, but identified with French paintings that had adopted Japanese pictorialism. I hope I've shown that Chinese modern painters' understanding and adoption of French painting was not the direct process it is often made out to be, but a complex one mediated by a localized history of sketching from life involving aesthetics and morality, linguistic instability, and Sino-Japanese and French-Japanese artistic relationships. Thank you.
All right, well, our final presenter is also one of our co-conveners today. Yukio Lippit is professor of history of art and architecture at Harvard University and specializes in Japanese painting. Most recently, he published The Artist in Edo, published by Yale University Press in 2018. And today, he will be giving a very concisely titled talk, Oily Painting. Thank you, Yukio Lippit.
We are not yet in a position to author individually or collectively a world history of oil painting. It is possible that the symposium will bring us a little bit closer. But should such a history be desirable, and if it were ever to be realized, it would, I propose, have to accord a prominent place to the Japanese painter Takahashi Yuuichi, who was active during the latter half of the 19th century. Yuuichi offers a crucial, if oblique, perspective on the nature and meaning of the art academy in Japan. His career parallels the emergence of various institutions that served as precursors to the Tokyo Art School of 1889, institutions that incorporate in one way or another the instruction of so-called academic genres and practices such as oil painting. Yet he was ultimately an outsider to these institutions, which is precisely what makes him a subject of interest for this gathering. Yuichi serves as a transitional figure who bridges the pre-modern era of the Tokugawa shogunate in the archipelago when the reception of oil painting centered around its conceptualization as a pictorial affect, and the era of the academy. Through his activities as a painter and teacher, as well as through his relentless authorship of treatises, manuals, and manifestos, Yuichi played a formative role in helping to define what I would call a provisional culture of oil painting in the archipelago, well before the systematic domestication there of art, bijutsu in Japanese, and its institutions. Yuichi's voluminous writings, which span the late 1860s until his death in 1894, focus as much on the unctuous, glistening nature of the oil medium in which colorants were suspended as in any other aspect of Western pictorialism. This emphasis on the tangibility or palpability of oil painting came at a significant and particularly dense moment in the ongoing acculturation of this form of picture making in the Japanese islands, where, while it began to face acute pressure to serve the new prerogatives of utility to the modern nation state and the quote-unquote civilization and enlightenment of Japanese society, oil painting was also engaging in stiff competition with emerging reprographic technologies, most notably photography, but also lithography and the new initiatives of traditional woodblock printmakers, amidst a rapidly changing ecology of images in the early Meiji period. During the headiness of the 1870s, Yuichi attempted to familiarize the physical properties of oil painting for domestic viewers, to sensitize his initial audiences to its muddy and glistening texture and the ontological authentication of its own truth claims that this somehow implied. So re-examining this project today, in turn, has the potential to defamiliarize us to the stuff of oil painting, to its odd thickness and its brute substantiality, as he calls it, which we have perhaps become overly comfortable overlooking. Now, in order to provide a context for the discussion that follows, let me briefly survey Yuichi's career and his relationship to other developments in 19th century Japanese culture. In 1862, he joined the Bureau of Painting, Gagakukyoku, in an institution called the Office for the Investigation of Western Writings, the Bansho Shirabesho, which was an institute established by the Tokugawa shogunate in the wake of increasingly threatening encounters with Western military entities, such as Commodore Matthew Perry, the head of the American Naval Fleet, who comes to Japan in 1853 and again in 1854. There, oil painting was studied along with map making and descriptive drawing in general as technical skills associated with European graphism and military and technological surveying methods. Apparently frustrated by his time at the Bureau, where he did not have the opportunity to study oil paintings firsthand, Yuichi supplemented his education with frequent visits to the newly established port city of Yokohama, which had opened in 1859. And there he sought out the Englishman Charles Wergman, a correspondent for the Illustrated London News, who was an amateur painter, apparently able to impart some knowledge about oil painting materials and techniques to his occasional visitor. Now, with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, however, the study of Western representation lost shogunal sponsorship. The shogunate was overthrown and replaced by a new oligarchy of politicians that would eventually lead to a kind of an imperial parliamentary government. So oil painting and Western representational methods would lose shogunal sponsorship for almost a decade, and Yuichi was forced to embark on a career in a craft almost entirely devoid of an audience in a public sphere. During the period between 1868 and 1876, when the College of Engineering, or Kobu Daigakko, was established and oil painting began to be taught by European instructors, knowledge about the genre was promulgated in only a handful of private academies established by the likes of Yuichi, whose own was called the Tenkaisha, and painters formerly associated with the Office for the Investigation of Western Writings. This period, though, proved crucial to the development of Yuichi's discourse, for in the absence of government support, he was forced to develop a sustained exposition of the many merits of oil in a framework that was both patriotic and entrepreneurial. So from the mid-1870s onward, Yuichi's career follows an interesting course, but one that was characterized by hard luck and increasing obsolescence. Although his private studio could boast dozens of students, and he was given occasional recognition by Japanese officialdom, such as the inclusion of 3 of his oil paintings in the Japanese pavilion at the 1873 World Exposition in Vienna, Yuichi was not necessarily at the vanguard of his craft, and his intense advocacy notwithstanding. When the College of Engineering was opened in 1876, the Italian painter Antonio Fontanesi was installed as professor of painting and established the first systematic academic instructional regimen for the acquisition of oil painting skills in Japan. Fontanesi used a wide array of standard Beaux-Arts teaching tools and taught students to sketch from plaster cast models in charcoal and crayon, pencil sketch from nature, chasse, outdoor xiaxiang, outdoor sketching, and produce landscape and figure paintings in oil. Despite staying in Japan a mere 2 years, Fontanesi counted among his pupils many Japanese who would go on to be notable figures in Meiji-era oil painting in the late 19th century. Although Yuichi himself consulted Fontanesi on numerous occasions, his own technique was quickly superseded by that of the Italian master's official pupils. And by the late 1870s, Yuichi's painting style had come to seem belabored and somewhat amateurish. Around 1881, 1882, furthermore, societal winds in Meiji-era Japan shifted toward a reevaluation of the intensive westernization of the 1870s, resulting in a new appreciation of indigenous cultural traditions. Antiquities began to be systematically surveyed and preserved, study groups for the appreciation of classical painting formed, and eventually a neo-traditional form of painting known as Nihonga emerged, one that selectively applied techniques of Western pictorialism to paintings of traditional Japanese and East Asian subject matter in classical formats and materials. And this Nihonga has come up in a number of presentations already. In the meantime, the College of Engineering and Technical Art School closed in 1883, and oil painting became the subject of increasingly vituperative debate, even being omitted from the national industrial fairs held periodically in Tokyo's Ueno Park. Nihonga was championed instead by the leading aestheticians of mid-Meiji and became the basis for the newly established Tokyo Art School in 1889. Amidst these rapid changes in the artistic landscape, Yuichi continued to paint and to author columns, reviews, and proposals, but became increasingly marginal to the yoga or Western-style painting movement. Even in 1889, when the leading oil painters in Japan banded together to form the Meiji Art Society, the elderly Yuichi was not even accorded a token role. In 1893, furthermore, the figure Kuroda Seki, who also appears in Ren's presentation, returned from a decade of art study in France to serve as a rallying point for younger oil painters in the society with his advocacy of a brighter palette, looser brushwork, and plein air methods. Eventually breaking away to establish the influential White Horse Society, Kuroda was also invited to join the faculty at the Tokyo Art School in 1896, finally establishing a presence for oil painting there 2 years after the death of Yuichi. And I should add that Kuroda is the painter of the image that graces the symposium poster. Now, with Kuroda's ascension, older yoga or Western-style painting practitioners came to be derisively referred to as the old school or even the resin school, Yaniha, because of the darkened palette and heavy varnish glazes with which they were associated, Yuichi included. Actually, no. By this time, Yuichi was not even sufficiently relevant to be included as a target of these indignities. My own attempt to recenter Yuichi begins by resituating him within a longer durée of the history of oil-based pigments in the archipelago. Oil painting actually was first systematically introduced to Japan, one might argue, in the seminarios or painting academies established by Jesuit missionaries on Kyushu Island in the last decades of the 16th century. In contrast to their impact in China, however, the Jesuit presence in Japan did not result in a significant artistic legacy, in large part due to the prohibition of Christianity there from 1614 onward. Quote-unquote Dutch learning, or dangaku, provided a more long-term foundation for painting in oil-based pigments, primarily because the Dutch East India Company was given exclusive trading rights with Japan through with the Tokugawa shogunate. But appropriate paintings and materials only occasionally entered through the port city of Nagasaki, and very few painters during the Edo period actually produced works on canvas in a substance that approximated European oil pigments. Thus, the history of Western-style painting in early modern Japan is less one of oil painting than of oily painting. And in fact, recently, Japanese specialists have begun to use the term oil-like, or aguraefu, in referring to this corpus. Edo period painters tended to produce an oil effect in one of three primary ways. The first was to mix traditional Japanese mineral pigments with oils that were indigenous to the archipelago, most commonly oil extracted from the perilla plant, otherwise, some of you may know, referred to as shiso in contemporary Japanese, which was runnier than the highly viscous drying oils of early modern Europe, such as linseed, poppy seed, walnut, safflower. And this perilla oil was often applied without other binders, primers, or varnishes to a paper or silk support, and it usually turns yellow within a period of a few years. Second, Japanese painters generated oily effects in painting by resorting to an indigenous medium known in Japanese as doroe, or paste painting, in which inexpensive mineral pigments were mixed with small amounts of water to generate a kind of a thick, opaque paint that was used usually to decorate kind of stage sets and shop signs in the Edo period. Apparently, the glutenosity and gumminess of doro pigment was understood as a reasonable counterfeit to the emulsive texture of paintings in oil. And sometimes this paste painting, or doroe, involved mixing lacquer sap. And apparently lacquer was used widely as a surrogate for oil. Indeed, in 1996, conservation and scientific analysis of the famous world map screens in the Imperial Household Collection, which date to the early 17th century, found that lacquer was the binder used in this work, and most likely this was also the case among other artworks depicting European subjects from the Jesuit seminarios of Western Japan. A final technique by which an oil-like resemblance was achieved in Edo period painting was simply to depict subjects in traditional Japanese materials and methods, but to add touches of animal glue or tree sap binder to the surface upon completion. And these touches added a certain luster that recalled the sheen of varnish and again represented a resourceful approximation of oil painting effects with indigenous materials. Now, we're only beginning to understand, thanks to the recent activity of conservation scientists in Japan and elsewhere, the inventive materiality of oily painting in the early modern era. In the past several years, for example, the synthetic pigment Berlin blue, which is usually associated by art historians with Hokusai's famous 36 views of Mount Fuji and other landscape paintings from the 1830s onwards, has been detected in a wide array of 18th century oil paintings in Japan from much earlier period, from in works such as Hiraga Gennai's Portrait of a Lady to various other works by artists working in the kind of Dutch learning school. Although Berlin blue was a liquid dye, synthetic dye that was quickly absorbed into its support, it was thought in Japan to match what was imagined to be the deeply saturated color of oil pigments, and was therefore accorded a privileged place on the Euro-pictorial palette. Its overseas origins no doubt reinforced its suitability as a surrogate for oil pigments. And for paintings on silk, the traditional technique of verso pigmentation, in which you apply color to the back of the silk so it shows through the porous silk surface and kind of in a dull sheen in front, was occasionally mobilized to approximate the chiaroscuro effects of Western models, as recently detected in this painting of two children with a dog. Now, such was the menu of options to reproduce oil painting effects encountered by Yuichi when he began to study oil painting at the Shogunal Painting Bureau during the 1860s. His supervisor was a figure named Kawakami Togai, who derived his knowledge of technique and materials almost entirely from books. And Yuichi would complain later of having never had the opportunity to study directly kind of model exemplary paintings in oil. And his trips to Yokohama, as well as a 3-month stint in 1867 to Shanghai, actually under the sponsorship of his own domain, began to afford him more encounters with oil paintings. And these initial encounters gave him a new appreciation for texture. Before then, Yuichi appears to have extrapolated and imagined an oil effect from older Japanese paintings, texts, and his own experimentation. And his earliest works demonstrate an ad hoc approach to the matter of materials. Yuichi himself, in his notebooks, relates that in his formative years as an oil painter, he used traditional Japanese mino paper instead of canvas, perilla oil, combined with ground-up shell white, kind of oyster shell, white pigment, and other local colorants, all mixed on a sashimi platter with a cutting knife and lacquerware spatula, demonstrating the extent to which he made do with found resources. The research of painting conservator Utada Shinsuke has revealed the degree to which each of his early paintings could differ in terms of their material profile, some even being constituted of ground-up brick to be used as a colorant. And it was only after his instruction under the Italian painter Antonio Fontanesi, who again came to teach at the Imperial College of Engineering in 1876, that Yuichi's technique and use of materials began to show some measure of consistency. Yet this stabilization also had the unfortunate result of normalizing Yuichi's painting into a quasi-academic style. Fontanesi himself has been described as a third-generation Barbizon master. And if this description does not quite excite you, you are not alone. Before his Barbizonization, however, Yuichi's painterly output had begun to shift in status from works that foregrounded method to ones that foregrounded material. And this evolution from exercises in illusionism to ones in emulsionism is most dramatically evident in a work known as The Courtesan or Oidang, easily one of his most visceral and affecting works. Painted in 1872, Oidang depicts a courtesan, of which Oidang was the highest rank, dressed in decorative robes and an impressive full set of tortoiseshell hair ornaments. The sitter is shown according to typical conventions of beauty prints, bijinga, of the Edo period, as a bust portrait in three-quarters pose. And as a number of commentators have already noted, one of the main purposes of the work was undoubtedly to de-idealize a common pictorial subject and thereby demonstrate the superiority and truth value of Western-style painting in relation to traditional Japanese mediums. The meaning of Oidang, the courtesan, was located, at least to some extent, in what it was not. That is to say, like a Japanese print of a beauty, a multicolor xylographic image in which the exoskeleton, the linear skeleton of the figure, was overlaid with color planes and pattern fields applied through printing blocks. Instead, its courtesan subject was shown as a somewhat elderly woman without makeup, staring meditatively or blankly in front of her. Rather than as a division of labor between lines and planes, her gaudy robes are depicted as an organic and crumpled whole, with highlighting and modeling used to depict its bends and folds. Yet, the courtesan is much more than a de-idealized transposition of a floating world or ukiyo-e subject into Western painting method. It contains an excess of pigmentation in its oily layers, which are built up into actually a remarkable surfacescape of thickly applied, unnecessarily accumulative stroke clusters. And this impasto is impossible to convey in slides, but is usually the most surprising element in live encounters with the painting. It is as if this kind of demi-monde entertainer is depicted in relief somewhere between painting and craft, between 2 and 3 dimensions. And although the portrait has also been interpreted as an homage to a hairstyle, here known as the hyogo curl or hyogo shitamage, that was characteristic of a nostalgic bygone era, it is as if the accoutrements and robes were specifically chosen to showcase the full range of textures inherent in the oil painting medium. Thus, the animal's fur, depicting the mane of a mythic Chinese lion on the courtesan's right sleeve, is furry in the most painterly sense. The scales of the carp on its opposite sleeve glisten like varnish, and the tortoiseshell hair ornaments emit a certain luminosity and translucence, an embodiment of the qualities that made oil the illusionistic medium par excellence in European pictorial culture of the early modern period. What in Japanese would be the shing or truth of the subject seems to be captured in this kind of congealed and coagulated thickness of the surface. And this idea of pictorial capture played a key role in Yuichi's evolving thought during the 1870s. During this period, as with the Hyogo curl hairstyle, he began to paint objects that reflected a rapidly vanishing world, such as the still life of a suit of traditional Japanese armor, a painting that was actually fairly recently discovered. For Yuichi, who was born into the warrior status group during the Edo period, the dismantling of the official status system in 1871 must have been a shock. And like many other members of a generation, he carried a status cling with him well into the Meiji period. Yuichi argued that oil painting was an ideal medium for the recording of a rapidly vanishing culture, as represented by the by then obsolete traditional armor suit. And in this regard, he was highly conscious of the emerging importance of photography, and in some cases specifically directed his polemic against photography. Oil painting, as opposed to photography, could last hundreds of years, and its colors wouldn't fade like the latter. Moreover, it was larger in size, it could be displayed in perpetuity in public halls, and everything from the martyrs of the Meiji state to indigenous cultural identity could be preserved in it. Ironically, Yuichi argued for the use of a westernizing medium to preserve and monumentalize all that westernization was replacing. Somehow, the craft-like incrustation of oil gave it a more firm ontological status as an instrument of recording. To be painted in oil was to be frozen in amber. Now, at the same time that Yuichi hoped to capture and monumentalize the evanescence of Japanese society in oil, he was also keenly aware of the need to familiarize and generate an audience for his work. He did so by producing a series of still lives, again in the 1870s, that depicted familiar, everyday things in his viscous medium. No work better captures the earnestness of this project than Tofu, now in the collection of the Kotohira Shrine in Shikoku Island. Here, 3 different types of the healthy bean curd are laid out on a cutting board, regular, grilled, and deep fried, in order to convey a variety of different textures. Even the moisture of the cutting board surface, as you can see, is depicted here. Now, this painting, which I consider a masterpiece of world art, but is more generally considered an oddity, was at the time viewed as polemical, arguing for and asserting its own relevance, forming and molding the very audience for which it was intended. Yuichi's tofu is very much about its own ability to depict tofu in all of its unique and gelatinous texture. Perhaps the crowning achievement of Yuichi's self-reflexive and didactic oil works is Salmon in the collection of Tokyo University of Fine Arts and Music. That's the kind of current institutional form of the Tokyo Art School. Here, another subject of generic familiarity is chosen to convey the merits of its medium. In this regard, it is well chosen, as the texture of the fish scales is predisposed to highlight the properties of oily pigment, and exposure of the upper portion of the fish further stages its ability to depict the moisture of freshly cut fish and other challenging textures. Furthermore, as this detail suggests to some extent, but a direct viewing again makes more obvious, the suspended salmon is covered with crests of welled-up pigment, a kind of surfeit of skin or superabundance of paint. Salmon speaks to the poignant historical reality that Yuichi was ahead of his time. Although treated today as an important moment in the early mastery of fine art painting in Japan, it was displayed at the time in a so-called oil painting tea house, Abudaya Chaya, which is a kind of a vaudevillian sideshow tent setting at a temple festival in Edo, alongside other paintings of sensational subjects, such as the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. This explains its trompe-l'oeil nature as well. Painted on paper, salmon was hung on a wall and apparently had a nail through the upper portion of the rope from which the fish is suspended in order to trick viewers into understanding it as part of the actual wall of the display room. As attested by Charles Worgman's wife, furthermore, in its vertical format, Yuichi was attempting to accommodate potential patrons who would have likened its scale to that of a traditional vertical hanging scroll and would otherwise have had no place to display oil paintings in their home. As Omuka Toshiro has argued, there was no critical mass of patrons for oil painting in Japan until around the 1920s, because there was no residential architecture that could accommodate it until this period. There just weren't the walls where you could hang framed oil paintings. And it has recently been suggested that these paintings were accompanied by oral commentary by a raconteur standing next to it, much like the raconteurs who provided live narration for silent films in Japan from the 1910s onward. No doubt these orators sensationalized the kind of hallucinatory verisimilitude of these oil renderings, providing performative counterparts to the thick glutinous swills of pigment on the surface of salmon and other works, which conveyed their own sense of performance. In its own time, however, instead of kind of naturalizing oil painting to uninitiated viewers as Yuichi had intended, these works must have ended up instead defamiliarizing familiar objects to bemused and possibly bewildered onlookers. Examining Yuichi, then, gives us a sense of what gets lost in the establishment of the Tokyo Art School in 1889 and the normalization of oil painting instruction in its curriculum in 1896 and beyond. Ultimately, his career and artistic output offer a case study in how the promotion of ideas and values associated with painting unfold when situated outside of an academic Beaux-Arts context. Thank you very much.